It was a typical evening after work. Josh had gotten home a little later than he had planned, having stayed at work to cover for a coworker who had called in sick. It wasn't unusual for him to help out, even if it meant putting his own things on hold. Mallory was already waiting for him at home, sitting on the couch in the living room with a glass of red wine in her hand. The TV was on, aimlessly playing some show she didn't even seem to be watching. "You're late again," she said without turning her head. Her voice was lazy, but with a slight hint of irritation. "You seem to have a special calling, to be convenient for everyone around you." Josh took off his coat, hung it neatly on the coat rack, and walked over to the couch. His gaze was as gentle as always. "Kevin's had a bad day today," he explained, sitting down next to him. "I decided to cover for him. It's only an hour late." Mallory glanced at him sideways. Her bright red nails tapped against her wine glass. "Of course you did. Josh is a superhero. No one should suffer while you are around. But what about us? When I say that I need you and not an all-powerful savior, do you help too, or are you just waiting for it to go away on its own?" He wanted to answer, but decided against it. Arguing with Mallory was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Josh knew that her irritation most often came not from him, but from work, stress, problems that she kept inside. So he simply put his hand on her knee and said quietly, "Sorry. I'll try to spend more time with us." She chuckled, turned away, and took a long sip of wine. Later that evening, they met friends at a bar. Mallory insisted that they go out to shake things up, although Josh would have preferred to stay home. The bar was as loud as always. They took their favorite table in the corner, which had become their regular spot over the last couple of years. The group was the same. Emma and Zach sat across from each other, deep in conversation. Luke was already pouring beers, and Sophie was trying to find a song on the karaoke machine. Josh ordered a beer for himself and sat off to the side, watching his friends laugh and argue. He liked being part of this little world, even if he rarely contributed to the discussions. Mallory, on the other hand, loved being the center of attention. Her laughter was louder than everyone else's, she interrupted the stories of others, and always found a way to turn the conversation back to herself. "You should have seen the way he let a guy get in line at the coffee shop yesterday," Mallory said loudly, turning to Luke. "He just stepped back, didn't even try to say a word. That's Josh. My peace-loving hero." Luke laughed, Emma smiled too, but Sophie glanced at Josh with a little concern. He didn't react, just took a sip of beer and looked away, as if it didn't concern him at all. But Mallory wasn't reassured. She moved closer to Luke, put her hand on his shoulder and added, "You know, Luke, sometimes I wonder if I'm lucky. I can do whatever I want, and Josh will still swallow it. He's like a sponge. He soaks up everything, insults, problems, my quirks, and just smiles." The words sounded like a joke, but there was something in them that touched everyone at the table. Luke looked a little embarrassed, moving away, and Sophie blushed, looking into her glass. Zach glanced at Josh briefly, as if waiting for a reaction, but Josh stayed where he was, simply taking another sip of beer. "It's okay," he said after a few seconds, his voice even and calm. "If it makes you feel better, go ahead." The words, spoken without malice or sarcasm, hung in the air. Mallory narrowed her eyes slightly, her lips stilling for a moment, as if she expected a different reaction. But Josh had already looked away, retreating into himself again. The bar was buzzing around him, voices drowning out the music, and Josh sat motionless, as if the world around him was somewhere far away. He knew Mallory would keep going until she found a new audience for her jokes. And that was fine for her. But that night, sitting at the bar, Josh suddenly realized that something inside him was starting to change. "Hey, who's next for a beer?" Luke called out, waving his empty mug. "Josh? You're always the most reliable." "I'll go," Josh said quietly, standing up. He stood up from the table, feeling the eyes on him. Luke and Zach exchanged a grin, and Mallory, not looking up from her drink, grumbled, "Sure, Josh. Why not? You're always ready." Josh said nothing. This was routine. Her jokes about his complicity had become routine over the last few months. He headed to the bar, waiting for a few people to be served before him. The line moved slowly, but he was patient, even when the man in front of him loudly demanded a special beer, causing the bartender to rush back and forth. "Josh, are you stuck in there?" a familiar voice called. He turned to see Mallory sitting on Luke's lap. Her face was flushed from the drink, her smile wide and challenging. Luke leaned slightly to the side, trying to avoid her ostentatious closeness, but she continued her show. "You know what I love about Josh," she announced loudly, attracting the attention of the neighboring tables. "He absorbs everything, my whims, your jokes, even our fucking problems. Anything to keep the peace." Laughter rang out around them. Luke gave a tight chuckle, rolling his eyes, and someone in the group slapped the table in approval. Josh stood at the bar, unmoving, but something inside him tensed. "Hey Josh," Mallory continued. "You wouldn't mind, would you? You're the quiet one." The bartender handed him the tray of drinks, but Josh didn't move. His hand froze on the tray's handle, his fingers clenched tighter than he'd expected. The bartender said something, but it was lost in the hubbub of conversations. Josh slowly walked back to the table, set the drinks in front of his friends, and sat down again. Mallory slid off Luke and plopped down next to him, smirking. She nudged him lightly in the side with her elbow. "You're kind of quiet today," she said, as if she weren't the cause of his silence. "Well, that's you. It's your style." "Yeah," he replied evenly, not looking up. She didn't even seem to notice. The conversation at the table continued. Suddenly, someone in the group mentioned a movie they'd recently watched that everyone had enjoyed, and the conversation moved on to another topic. But for Josh, it was just a ringing silence. A half-hour later, their evening was interrupted by a random guest. One of the men from the next table, clearly a participant in some kind of bachelor party, abruptly leaned back, losing his balance. His chair collided with Josh, spilling beer on his shirt. The man quickly stood up, raising his hands in an apology. "Oh man, my bad," he muttered, not even looking at Josh before turning back to his friends. Josh exhaled, took out a napkin and began wiping the wet cloth. His movements were smooth but focused. "Are you serious?" Mallory's voice rang out. She turned to the others, as if about to share another funny story. "Did you see that? He just got himself drenched and didn't even say anything." Zach started laughing, and Luke tried to say something to change the subject, but Mallory was already in high spirits. "Josh, honey, you're always like this. You're such a master of self-control. Seriously, what are you afraid of? Why can't you ever stand up for yourself?" He looked up slowly. "It's just beer," he said calmly, but there was something new in his voice. "No, it's not just beer. This is another situation where you decided to do nothing. Like always." Mallory giggled, turning to the others. "You know, he's so convenient. I can do anything and he'll still take it. He's just," she hesitated, as if searching for the words, then added with a wide grin, "like a doormat." At that moment, Josh felt something inside him break. It was like the sound of glass cracking from too much pressure. He slowly set his mug down on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood up. Josh set the mug down with a quiet but distinct sound that made Mallory stop mid-sentence. He rose slowly, his movements unexpectedly calm, almost lazy, but there was something new in his eyes. Eyes that usually radiated warmth and softness now looked cold as steel. The table became so quiet that even the distant clinking of glasses from across the bar seemed loud. Josh straightened up, looking around at his friends, lingering on each of them, as if considering how much they truly deserved to be in his life. Then he settled on Mallory. "You know," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, but everyone heard it. "I've been putting up with this for a long time." Mallory blinked, her confidence wavering. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Josh raised a hand, stopping her. The gesture was gentle but firm, and she fell silent. "You always find a way to make a fool out of me," he continued. "In front of everyone. Over and over again. Every joke you make, every comment you make. You justify it all by saying, 'Oh, Josh can handle it.' Josh would never be offended." He took a step toward the table, bracing his hands on the edge. "You know what I realized? You're right. I did. I stayed quiet when you made me look weak. I stayed quiet when you made me look like I was nothing to you. Because I thought it was best. For both of us." He glanced around at his friends, who sat in awkward silence. Zach was nervously rubbing his chin, Luke was avoiding his gaze, and Sophie looked like she wanted to get up and leave. "And you?" Josh asked, turning to face them. "How many times have you laughed with her when you knew it wasn't funny? How many times have you added fuel to the fire just to amuse yourself?" Luke opened his mouth to say something, but Josh didn't give him a chance. "No, Luke. Don't even try. You're too busy being her shadow." He looked back at Mallory, and his voice became quieter, almost gentle, which made her shudder. You like to say that I'm afraid of conflict, that I'm weak. But you know what's ironic? You're more afraid than me. You're afraid that without your jokes, without constantly attacking me, you'll be empty. You just have nothing left. Mallory tried to smile, but her lips trembled. Josh. You know she began, but her voice broke. Just. He repeated with a bitter smile. You really think you can call this simple? You humiliated me in front of everyone today, and I'm sure you'll tell this story to someone else tomorrow. But you know what's different? I won't let you do it again today. He straightened up, looked around the table one more time, as if memorizing the faces of those who had been part of this moment, and turned to leave. Mallory tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away as if her touch burned. Don't, he said softly but firmly. Not anymore. He stepped away, leaving her standing at the table with a confused expression on her face. There was silence behind him, broken only by the hum of the bar. Josh opened the door, and the cold night air hit him in the face. He took a deep breath and walked forward, feeling something heavy fall from his shoulders. No one at the table moved. No one said a word. Only Luke awkwardly reached for his beer, but even he stopped before taking a sip. Mallory stood at the bar, her feet rooted to the floor. Her knees were shaking, her heart was beating like it was trying to escape her chest. Josh had disappeared through the door a few minutes ago, but the air around her felt like it had been sucked out. She turned to her friends, expecting someone to break the tension with a joke, but their faces only increased her anxiety. Zach was staring into his glass, Luke was pretending to search the floor for something, and Sophie, usually silent, looked at Mallory with reproach. Well, he'll come back, Mallory said uncertainly, clearing her throat to make her voice sound stronger. He always comes back. Are you sure? Sophie whispered, but her words were louder than the music blaring from the speakers. The quiet question hit like a hammer. Mallory steeled herself and grabbed her bag. Her voice was sharp and loud, even though she was shaking inside. Okay guys, I need to catch up with him. She ran out of the bar, stumbling over the threshold. The night air hit her face, cool and damp. She quickly looked around. Josh's car was in the parking lot. He couldn't have left. But where was he? Josh, she shouted, her voice breaking. She began to circle the parking lot, trying not to panic. Her heels clicked loudly on the asphalt, and every movement sent pain through her ears. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the sound of a bottle breaking, night-goers, but not Josh. At the corner of the parking lot, she spotted a familiar figure sitting on a low stone wall. Josh was hunched over, his shoulders slumped, his hands clutching his head. She froze, feeling her fear mingle with relief. He was here. But how could she approach him? She moved toward him, her steps slow, careful, as if any movement would shatter the fragile silence between them. Josh, she said softly, stopping a few feet away. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. Please say something, she added. The silence was frightening. Mallory felt a cold sweat trickle down her back. She took another step forward. You're right, her voice wavered, but she continued. I was terrible. I know that. I understand. I just... Stop it, he finally said. Low, quiet, but full of tension. She fell silent, the words caught in her throat. Do you understand? He looked up, and there was no warmth or pain in his eyes. Only cold weariness. How many times have I asked you to stop? How many times have I told you it hurt? Do you really think I'm going to believe that you suddenly understood? Josh. She began, but he cut her off. No, his voice grew louder, sharper. He stood up, his movement abrupt, almost threatening, and Mallory instinctively took a step back. You don't realize it now. You only realized it because I left. His words cut through her like a knife. I didn't know it had gone this far. Her voice was weaker than she had hoped. Josh chuckled, but there was no joy in it. Of course I didn't. You were too busy being the queen of the party. You didn't care how I felt. Mallory felt a lump in her throat. She took another step forward, her hand instinctively reaching for his shoulder. Please, give me a chance to make it right. You were always there for me, and I just... The words came out in a spurt, and she couldn't stop them. You just... He turned to her, his gaze so sharp that she stepped back again. You just wanted attention? You wanted to have fun at my expense? Have you ever thought about how I feel?" Mallory didn't know what to say. The words that always came out so easily on her lips suddenly felt slurred and useless. "I don't know what else to say," she finally admitted. Josh was silent for a few seconds, then his shoulders relaxed a little, but his face remained serious. "Then maybe try not to say anything." With that, he turned and walked to his car. Mallory stood transfixed, watching him get behind the wheel and drive away, leaving her in the silence and darkness. She didn't know how long she stood there. Minutes stretched into hours, and only the cold night wind finally made her return to the bar. But when she opened the door, expecting to see the comforting faces of her friends, they were not there. The table was empty. She noticed Sophie's forgotten scarf on the bartender's counter, but none of her group remained to support her. "They left about 15 minutes ago," the bartender said, noticing her gaze. Mallory nodded, but inside she felt something breaking again. Josh was gone. Her friends were gone. And she was left. Alone. It had been a week since the night Josh left, and since then he had completely disappeared from her life. His social media feeds were blank, and mutual friends avoided mentioning his name, clearly preferring not to get involved. Mallory's phone sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking time bomb. The screen was blank, without a single notification. No text, no call, nothing. Mallory paced the apartment like a cornered animal. Her mind was racing with one idea: she had to fix this. She had to find a way to get through to him, to get him back. She grabbed the phone and started typing again. The screen read, "Josh, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. Can we talk?" Her finger hovered over the send button. It was the 5th message in the last 2 days. They had all gone unanswered. Gritting her teeth, she hit send, and the text disappeared into the digital void. She threw the phone on the couch and put her head in her hands. "He just has to text me back," she whispered to herself, but her voice was unconvincing. The next day, Mallory decided to take a more decisive action. She knew where he worked. This was her last chance. Wearing the modest dress he always liked and pulling her hair back into a ponytail, she headed to Josh's office. It had been raining since early morning, filling the streets with muddy streams of water. Mallory parked her car near the office and slowly walked toward the glass doors. Her legs felt heavy, as if the ground beneath them was getting stickier with each passing second. As she stepped inside, she felt the air conditioning hit her face. The reception area was almost empty, save for a young woman in a formal suit who was looking at her questioningly. "How can I help you?" the woman asked. "I'm looking for Josh." Mallory's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Josh Stanton." The woman glanced at her computer, her fingers quickly running across the keyboard. "Miss, I'm afraid Josh is not in the office today." "Not in the office?" Mallory asked, her heart sinking. "Yes, he works from home. I can give him a message if you'd like." "No thank you," she said, turning quickly and walking away. She stepped outside, the rain lashing her face. Mallory stood in the downpour, unsure of where to go. She couldn't just give up. He works from home, she remembered. It was the only place she could try again. Half an hour later, she parked in front of his house. The lights were on, but the curtains were tightly drawn. Josh's car was in its usual place, which caused an odd mixture of relief and fear. She took a deep breath, walked up to the door, and knocked. At first, nothing. Just the sound of rain pounding the roof. She knocked again, a little louder this time. A few moments later, she heard footsteps. The door opened, and Josh stood there. His face was calm but cold. No hint of his usual kindness. He just looked at her, saying nothing. "Hello," she said quietly. Can I come in?" He was silent for a moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Mallory walked into the living room. Everything was just as she remembered. The shelf with his favorite books, the blanket he always kept on the couch to keep him warm in the evenings. Everything looked so familiar that her heart ached. "Why did you come?" His voice was sharp, and she flinched. She turned to him, her eyes filling with tears. "Josh, I wanted to apologize. I was terrible to you. I realize that now. She stumbled, trying to find the words. "I just don't want to lose you." He crossed his arms over his chest, remaining where he was. "Are you apologizing because I left? Or are you apologizing because you're truly sorry?" "Josh, I'm truly sorry. I don't know why I acted like that. I just, he interrupted her. How many times have you said that word? Just kidding, just lightening the mood. You're still trying to justify your behavior even now. She paused, realizing she didn't have an answer. You came here for me to tell you it's okay? So I could forget it all again, he continued. But I can't do that this time. I know, she whispered, looking down. But please, give me a chance to make it right. Josh came closer, and for a moment she thought he was going to hug her. Instead, he just stood in front of her, his gaze unmoving. You know what's hardest? He asked. It wasn't your behavior. It wasn't your jokes. It was that I actually believed you could change. She looked up, but tears were blurring everything. You can stay, he finally said, stepping back. But just to talk. And then go. Her heart sank. She knew this was her only chance. Mallory sat on the edge of the couch, like a student in front of a stern teacher. The skin of her palms was damp with tension, and the words she had so carefully prepared crumbled like sand under Josh's icy gaze. He stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the rain-drenched street. The silence stretched on forever, broken only by the patter of raindrops on the glass. Speak, he finally said, without turning his head. Mallory exhaled sharply, as if about to jump into cold water. I know what I did. I know I ruined everything, she began, her voice shaking, but she tried to hold on. I used you, Josh. I did it for attention, for something I probably didn't have myself. He didn't turn around. His silence weighed on her, drowning out her voice more than any words could. I didn't fully understand how much I was hurting you. I thought it was just a joke, just... She paused, remembering his words at the bar, just something to laugh about. But now I know I was wrong. Josh turned slowly. His face was calm, but his eyes were wary. He didn't answer, and that spurred her on. You were there, always, even when I didn't deserve it. And I laughed at it, not realizing that I was destroying you. Her voice broke, and she nervously ran a hand through her hair. I'm not asking you to forget it all or pretend it never happened. I just want a chance. A chance to prove that I can be different. That I can be better. For both of us. He was silent for a few more seconds, then stepped to the chair opposite her and sat down, resting his hands on the armrests. Is that all? He asked. She blinked, confused. I don't know what else to say, she whispered. Josh chuckled, and the sound made her flinch. You know, he began, leaning forward, I've learned a lot in the last week. I realized that I was too patient. I turned a blind eye to what you did for too long. And I'm guilty of that, too. Because I let you think it was okay. Mallory opened her mouth to protest, but he raised a hand, stopping her. No. Let me finish. His voice was firm, but not angry. You say you want to fix this. But I'm not sure you can. She looked at him like someone who'd just been punched. I want to try, she said quickly. I can change. Are you sure you want to? Josh raised an eyebrow, a strange mix of weariness and curiosity in his eyes. Do you really want to be with someone who now knows how easily you can destroy? Who will always remember the way you used to act? Mallory jumped up, her heart pounding. I know what I did. And I'm going to work on myself so you can see that it won't happen again. I'm just asking you to give me a chance, Josh. One chance. Josh stood up. His height and calm made her take a step back. You've had your chance, Mallory. More than once. I've given you them over and over again. And you know what I've learned? Sometimes forgiveness isn't weakness. But sometimes it's not what's needed. He walked past her to the door, opened it, and looked up at the night sky, where the rain had finally begun to ease. If you want to change, that's fine, he said, not looking at her. But it's none of my business anymore. You're just leaving? Her voice was sharp, almost screaming. He turned, looking at her with a soft expression that was both kind and ruthless. No, Mallory. You're the one leaving. She froze, her feet unmoving, as if rooted to the floor. Josh, please, her voice broke, and she took a step toward him, but he didn't move. Go away, Mallory. And for heaven's sake, learn to respect those around you. She knew he wouldn't change his mind. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her bag and walked past him. As her heels touched the porch, the door closed behind her with a soft click. The rain had picked up again. She stood under a sky where there were no stars left, feeling the drops running down her face. But it wasn't just the rain. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text. Not from Josh, but from Sophie. "We're here for you if anything happens. Cole." Mallory wanted to throw the phone away, but instead she clutched it in her hand, as if it were her last hope of connecting with the world. She took a deep breath and headed for the car. The engine started on the first try, but the sound seemed distant and empty. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.